The voicemail was left at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of teaching my sophomore biology class when my phone, tucked away in my desk drawer, quietly recorded the message that would change everything. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Hi, Madison. This is Jennifer from Dr. Patterson's office. I'm calling to let you know that your appointment scheduled for Thursday has been canceled. Your mother called this morning and said the family decided it wasn't necessary right now. She mentioned you'd be going to urgent care instead if needed. Have a great day. I didn't hear this message until 6:30 that evening, after grading papers and staying late to help struggling students with their cellular respiration homework. By then, the doctor's office was closed, and the earliest I could call back would be the next morning. But even if I had heard it immediately, I'm not sure the shock would have been any less devastating. My name is Madison Clark, and I was 29 years old when my own family decided my health wasn't worth prioritizing. The appointment they canceled was with Dr. Patterson, a gastroenterologist I'd been trying to see for 3 months. The earliest available slot had been this Thursday, and I'd been counting down the days. For 6 months, I'd been experiencing symptoms that were becoming impossible to ignore. It started with what I thought was just stress from my new teaching position at Roosevelt High School, stomach pain that came and went, fatigue that no amount of coffee could fix, and a persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with my body. My primary care physician, Dr. Martinez, had run basic blood work that came back normal, but she was concerned enough to refer me to a specialist. Sometimes these things can be tricky to diagnose, she'd said, her kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. Dr. Patterson is excellent. He'll get to the bottom of this. Getting that appointment had been a victory in itself. Dr. Patterson's office had a 3-month waiting list, and I felt genuine relief when his scheduler called to confirm the Thursday slot. I'd already arranged for a substitute teacher, knowing the appointment might take most of the morning with potential tests and procedures. I lived in Millbrook, a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone else's business. My family had deep roots here. The Clarks had been prominent members of the community for generations. My father, Robert Clark, owned the largest insurance agency in town, Clark's & Associates, which had been in the family for 40 years. My mother, Patricia Clark, was the kind of woman who organized charity galas and sat on the school board. My older brother, Daniel, had followed in our father's footsteps and worked at the agency as a senior partner. On the surface, we looked like the perfect American family, the kind you'd see in a Norman Rockwell painting, gathered around a dinner table on Sundays, discussing local politics and community events. But beneath that polished exterior was a dynamic I'd been too naive to recognize for what it really was. Patricia Clark was not a woman who tolerated inconvenience, and she had very specific ideas about what constituted a real problem worth addressing. In her mind, if something couldn't be seen or easily explained, it probably wasn't that serious. She'd grown up in an era where you walked off injuries and pushed through discomfort. The idea of spending time and money on what she called vague complaints was to her a sign of weakness. Madison has always been dramatic about these things. I'd heard her telling Mrs. Henderson from next door a few weeks earlier. Even as a child, a little stomachache would send her into theatrics. Some people are just more sensitive. This conversation had taken place in our kitchen while I was upstairs, supposedly out of earshot. But the house was old, with thin walls and creaky floors that carried sound. I'd been lying on my childhood bed, clutching a heating pad to my abdomen, trying to find a position that didn't make the pain worse. The dismissal in her voice had cut deeper than any physical pain I was experiencing. This wasn't a scrapped knee or a headache. This was something that was affecting my ability to work, to sleep, to live normally. But in Patricia's world, if it wasn't obvious and acute, it wasn't worth the fuss. My father's approach was different, but equally damaging. Robert Clark was a practical man who saw everything through the lens of cost-benefit analysis. He'd built his insurance business by understanding risk, by calculating what was worth protecting and what wasn't. In his mind, a specialist appointment was expensive and unnecessary when urgent care could provide the same service for a fraction of the cost. Why spend $300 to see some fancy doctor when you can get checked out at MedExpress for $50? They have all the same equipment, same training. You're just paying for the name on the door. I tried to explain that Dr. Martinez specifically wanted me to see a gastroenterologist, that this wasn't something a general practitioner at urgent care could properly evaluate. But my father had that look in his eyes, the same look he got when he was explaining to clients why their claims were being denied. Patient, condescending, and absolutely certain of his position. Doctors always refer you to specialists, he'd said, cutting into his pot roast with deliberate precision. It's how they make money. Most of the time, it's completely unnecessary. Your mother had stomach problems when she was your age, and you know what fixed it? Better diet and less stress. No expensive tests needed.
Daniel, my older brother, had been noticeably silent during this conversation. At 32, he'd always been the golden child. Successful, married to his college sweetheart Sarah, father to two adorable kids who were the apple of my parents' eyes, he'd inherited not just a place in the family business, but also my parents' tendency to view problems through a purely practical lens. "Maybe Dad has a point," he'd finally said, not looking directly at me. "I mean, if it's been going on this long and you're still functioning fine, how serious can it be? You're teaching every day, you seem fine when we see you. Maybe it's just one of those things that will resolve on its own." The word functioning had stuck with me for days. Yes, I was still showing up to work. Yes, I was still smiling and making small talk with my fellow teachers. But functioning and thriving were two very different things. I was running on fumes, pushing through pain that sometimes made me dizzy, and spending my evenings curled up on my couch with a heating pad, too exhausted to do anything else. But my family didn't see those moments. They saw me at Sunday dinners where I put on a brave face because I'd learned early that complaining made everyone uncomfortable. They saw me at Daniel's kids' birthday parties where I played the fun aunt despite feeling like my insides were on fire. They saw the performance, not the reality. The reality was that I'd lost 15 pounds in 2 months, not from trying to diet, but because eating had become a gamble. Some foods would trigger hours of pain, and I'd developed an anxiety around meals that was becoming its own problem. The reality was that I'd started sleeping sitting up some nights because lying down made the pain worse. The reality was that I'd begun researching my symptoms obsessively online, finding everything from stress-related disorders to much more serious conditions that made my blood run cold. But I'd made the mistake of sharing these fears with my family, thinking they would provide support and encouragement. Instead, my mother had fixed me with that look of hers, the one that said I was being melodramatic and attention-seeking. "You can't believe everything you read on the internet, Madison," she'd said, her voice carrying the tone she used with particularly slow students when she volunteered at the elementary school. "Of course you're going to find scary diagnoses when you go looking for them. That's exactly why you need to stop researching and just wait to see what a real doctor says." The irony was thick enough to choke on. She wanted me to wait for a real doctor's opinion, but she was simultaneously working to prevent me from seeing one. My teaching colleagues had been more supportive than my own family. Janet Morrison, the veteran chemistry teacher who'd taken me under her wing, had noticed my decreased energy and occasional winces of pain during our shared lunch period. "Honey, you need to get that checked out properly," she'd said, her maternal instincts in full force. "I had a cousin who had similar symptoms, and it turned out to be something that needed real treatment. Don't let anyone talk you out of seeing a specialist." Even my students had noticed something was off. Teenagers are remarkably perceptive when they want to be, and several had asked if I was feeling okay. The fact that a group of 15-year-olds were showing more concern for my well-being than my own parents was both touching and heartbreaking. But my family's attitude had a way of making me question my own perceptions. When people you love and trust repeatedly tell you that you're overreacting, you start to wonder if maybe you are. Maybe the pain wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I was weak for not just pushing through it like my mother had suggested. This self-doubt was exactly what allowed them to make the decision they made. When Patricia Clark called Dr. Patterson's office that Tuesday morning, she wasn't just canceling an appointment. She was taking control of a situation she felt had gotten out of hand. In her mind, she was being the responsible adult, saving the family money and preventing me from going down what she saw as an unnecessary medical rabbit hole. She probably felt justified, even righteous, as she explained to Jennifer, the scheduler, that the family had decided urgent care would be more appropriate. She likely used her most authoritative voice, the one that had intimidated PTA presidents and charity committee members for decades. She probably said something about young people today being too quick to seek expensive specialty care, about how things were handled differently in her generation. What she didn't consider, what she was incapable of considering, was that she had just violated my autonomy as an adult in the most fundamental way possible. She had made a medical decision for a 29-year-old woman without consent, without discussion, and without any real understanding of what was at stake. The appointment she canceled wasn't just a doctor's visit. It was my hope for answers, for validation, for the possibility that whatever was wrong with me could be identified and treated. It was my chance to stop feeling like I was slowly deteriorating while everyone around me insisted I was fine. As I sat in my empty classroom that Tuesday evening listening to that voicemail for the third time, I felt something crack inside my chest. It wasn't just disappointment or frustration. It was the sound of trust breaking, of the fundamental belief that family members look out for each other being shattered beyond repair. I called my mother immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. "Oh, Madison," she said when I asked about the appointment, her tone suggesting I was bothering her with something trivial. "I meant to talk to you about that. Your father and I discussed it, and we really think urgent care is the better option. Dr. Patterson is terribly expensive, and honestly, dear, if this was something serious, wouldn't you be sicker by now? You're still working, still getting around fine. It's probably just stress or something you ate." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off.
"Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "this appointment took 3 months to get. Dr. Martinez specifically referred me to him. This isn't something urgent care can handle." "Nonsense," she replied briskly. "Doctors are doctors, and frankly, I think you've been dwelling on this too much. Sometimes the best medicine is to stop thinking about your symptoms and just get on with life. Your grandmother had stomach problems her whole life, and she lived to be 89. She never needed any fancy specialists." The comparison to my grandmother, who had suffered in silence through what we now know were likely serious digestive issues, was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Patricia was essentially telling me that suffering was hereditary, expected, and something to be endured rather than treated. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The people who were supposed to protect me, support me, and advocate for my well-being had instead decided I wasn't worth the investment. They'd made a decision about my body, my health, and my future without including me in the conversation. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The canceled appointment was the first domino in a chain of events that would reveal the true nature of my family's love: conditional, controlling, and ultimately devastating. What I thought was a simple disagreement about medical care was actually the moment the mask slipped, revealing something much darker underneath. But that realization was still to come. For now, I was just a woman whose family had decided her pain wasn't real enough, her concerns weren't valid enough, and her health wasn't worth enough to pursue proper medical care. I had no idea that this betrayal would pale in comparison to what was coming next. 3 weeks after the canceled appointment, I was grading midterm exams when the pain hit differently. Not the familiar ache I'd grown accustomed to, but something sharp and urgent that made me double over at my desk. The red pen in my hand clattered to the floor as I pressed both palms against my abdomen, gasping. The attack lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of feeling like something was tearing inside me. 20 minutes of cold sweats and nausea so severe I couldn't stand upright. When it finally subsided, I was shaking and exhausted, my white blouse damp with perspiration. I drove myself to MedExpress, the urgent care clinic my father had insisted was equivalent to specialist care. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and desperation, filled with people nursing minor injuries and common illnesses. I sat hunched in an uncomfortable plastic chair, feeling utterly out of place. Dr. Kevin Walsh, the urgent care physician, was a tired-looking man in his 50s who examined me with the efficiency of someone processing an assembly line. He pressed on my stomach, asked about my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and ran through a checklist of symptoms with clinical detachment. "Everything seems normal," he concluded after a cursory examination. "Your vital signs are stable, no obvious signs of distress. Probably just gastritis or stress-related symptoms, common in young professionals. I'll prescribe an antacid and recommend you follow up with your primary care doctor if symptoms persist." When I mentioned Dr. Martinez's referral to a gastroenterologist, Dr. Walsh's expression shifted to something approaching annoyance. Specialists are expensive and often unnecessary for functional digestive issues. These symptoms usually resolve with lifestyle changes. Less caffeine, better sleep, stress management. The antacid should help with the immediate discomfort. I left with a prescription for over-the-counter medication I could have bought myself and a growing sense that everyone was determined to minimize what I was experiencing. The entire visit had taken less than 15 minutes and cost $60 that felt wasted. That evening, I called my mother to update her on the urgent care visit, hoping she might recognize that this wasn't resolving on its own, as she had predicted. "See?" Patricia's voice carried a note of vindication. "I told you urgent care would take care of it. No need for all that expensive specialist nonsense. Dr. Walsh is a real doctor, and he gave you medicine. Problem solved." But the problem wasn't solved. The antacids provided minimal relief, and the attacks became more frequent. I started carrying a small notebook, documenting each episode, the time, duration, severity, and any potential triggers. The data painted a concerning picture of escalating symptoms that seemed to follow no logical pattern. My teaching began to suffer. During a lesson on the circulatory system, another wave of pain hit so suddenly that I had to excuse myself, leaving my confused students with instructions to read Chapter 12 while I locked myself in the faculty bathroom, writing out the attack while sitting on the cold tile floor. Janet Morrison found me there 20 minutes later. "Madison, honey, this is getting serious. You can't keep pushing through this. Something is really wrong." "My family thinks I'm being dramatic," I whispered, ashamed of the admission. "They say if it was serious, I'd be sicker, that I'm still functioning, so it can't be that bad." Her expression hardened. "Functioning? Sweetheart, you're barely surviving. I've watched you deteriorate for months. Your family doesn't see you here doubled over in pain. They don't see you struggling to get through lessons or eating nothing but crackers at lunch because everything else makes you sick." Her words were a lifeline. Someone else could see what my family refused to acknowledge. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't being dramatic. Something was genuinely wrong. But when I tried to schedule another appointment with Dr. Patterson, I discovered my insurance had been changed. My father, who managed the family's health insurance through his agency, had switched me to a high-deductible plan that made specialist visits prohibitively expensive unless I met a $3,000 deductible first. "It's better coverage overall," he explained when I called him in a panic. "Lower monthly premiums, and if you really need medical care, you'll get it. But it prevents unnecessary doctor shopping for minor issues."
The phrase doctor shopping stung, as if seeking appropriate medical care for persistent symptoms was some kind of addiction or character flaw. The new insurance meant I'd have to pay the full cost of the specialist visit up front, nearly $400 I didn't have on a teacher's salary.
My brother Daniel's response was even more dismissive when I reached out to him for support. "Madison, you need to listen to yourself," he said during a tense phone conversation. "You've been obsessing over this for months. Maybe the problem isn't physical. Maybe you should consider seeing someone about anxiety or depression instead. Mental health issues can manifest as physical symptoms." The suggestion that my pain was psychological felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. Daniel had always been the family member I felt closest to, the one who might understand. But he'd fully aligned himself with our parents' narrative that I was an unreliable narrator of my own experience. "I know the difference between anxiety and physical pain," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I've had anxiety before. This isn't that." "Look, I'm not trying to be mean," Daniel continued, "but you've always been the sensitive one in the family. Remember when you were convinced you had mono in high school and it turned out to be nothing? Or when you thought you had a learning disability because math was hard for you? Maybe you just catastrophize health issues." Those comparisons were unfair, and he knew it. The mono incident had been a legitimate concern. I'd been exhausted for weeks with swollen glands. The testing came back negative, but the symptoms had been real. The math struggles were actual learning differences that were never properly addressed because admitting I needed help would have reflected poorly on the family's image of academic excellence. But Daniel was rewriting history to fit the current narrative. In his version, I was a hypochondriac with a pattern of seeking attention through medical complaints. It was gaslighting disguised as loving concern. The isolation was becoming unbearable. My own family had closed ranks against me, presenting a united front that my health concerns were invalid. They spoke about me in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear, using phrases like attention-seeking and always been dramatic. At Thanksgiving dinner, the subtext became text. We were gathered around the dining room table that had hosted decades of family celebrations. The same table where I'd announced my acceptance to college, my first teaching job, every milestone of my life. But now it felt like a tribunal. "Madison looks thin," my Aunt Carol observed, studying me with concern. "Are you eating enough, honey?" Before I could answer, my mother jumped in with practiced efficiency. "She's been having some stomach issues, but nothing serious. You know how young people are these days, always thinking they need specialists for every little thing. We've taken care of it." The casual dismissal delivered in front of extended family was humiliating. I was being characterized as a child who couldn't manage her own healthcare decisions, whose concerns were so frivolous they warranted public mockery. "Actually," I said, finding my voice, "I'm still having significant pain and I haven't been able to get proper medical care because—" "Madison," my father interrupted, his tone carrying a warning, "let's not bore everyone with medical talk during dinner." The message was clear. My health problems were inappropriate dinner conversation, too trivial to warrant discussion among adults. I spent the rest of the meal in silence, picking at my food while conversations flowed around me as if I wasn't there. That night, alone in my apartment, I researched my symptoms more intensively than ever before. The internet, which my mother had warned me against consulting, became my only source of information. What I found terrified me. My combination of symptoms, persistent abdominal pain, weight loss, fatigue, and the specific type of attacks I was experiencing matched several serious conditions that required immediate medical intervention. Some were chronic but manageable with proper treatment. Others were progressive and potentially life-threatening if left untreated. But I had no way to get answers.
My family had effectively cut off my access to appropriate medical care, and my financial situation made self-pay impossible. I was trapped in a nightmare where I could research my symptoms, but couldn't get them properly evaluated. The attacks were becoming more severe and frequent. I started keeping a heating pad in my classroom and several times had to teach entire lessons while pressing it against my abdomen under my blazer. My students noticed but didn't comment, though I caught them exchanging worried glances. One December morning, I woke up with blood in my stool. Not a small amount that could be dismissed as hemorrhoids or minor irritation, but enough to make the toilet water pink. I sat on my bathroom floor, staring at the evidence that something was seriously wrong, and called my mother with shaking hands. Blood? My Patricia's voice carried irritation rather than concern. Madison, you're probably just being dramatic again. A little bit of blood isn't unusual with stomach upset. You've been taking those antacids, right? Sometimes they can cause minor irritation. Mom, this isn't a minor irritation. This is... I don't want to hear it, she cut me off. You're working yourself up over nothing. Take some Pepto-Bismol and stop looking for problems that aren't there.
She hung up before I could respond. I sat on my cold bathroom floor, holding my phone, realizing that my own mother had just dismissed blood in my stool as drama and attention-seeking behavior. That was the moment I understood with crystal clarity that my family wasn't just unsupportive, they were actively dangerous to my health. Their refusal to take my symptoms seriously wasn't just misguided, it was potentially life-threatening. I called in sick to school for the first time since the symptoms began. Not because I was too weak to teach, but because I needed time to figure out how to save my own life when the people who were supposed to protect me had abandoned me completely. Sitting in my small apartment, surrounded by medical research printouts and symptom journals, I faced a horrifying reality. I was completely alone in this fight. My family had not only failed to support me, they had actively sabotaged my attempts to get help. But I was also beginning to realize something else, something that would eventually fuel everything that came next. They were wrong about me. I wasn't dramatic or attention-seeking or hypochondriacal. I was sick, possibly seriously sick, and I was the only person who seemed to care about finding out why. That realization would change everything. The discovery came by accident, buried in a stack of mail I was sorting through during winter break. Hidden between credit card offers and grocery store circulars was an envelope addressed to me from Millbrook General Hospital's billing department. I almost threw it away, assuming it was another piece of junk mail, but something about the official letterhead made me pause. Inside was a bill for emergency room services dated 6 months ago, a date when I had never set foot in any emergency room. The charges were for comprehensive blood work, imaging studies, and consultation fees totaling over $2,000. According to the documentation, Madison Clark had received extensive testing for abdominal pain and digestive issues. But I had never been to Millbrook General's emergency room. My hands trembled as I read through the itemized charges. CT scan of abdomen and pelvis, complete metabolic panel, inflammatory markers, celiac disease screening, tests I had been desperately trying to get through proper channels for months, tests my family had prevented me from obtaining. Someone had used my name and insurance information to receive medical care. Someone who shared my symptoms, my concerns, and apparently my identity. I called the hospital's billing department immediately, my heart pounding as I waited on hold for 15 minutes listening to instrumental versions of popular songs. "This is Jennifer and patient billing. How can I help you?" "I received a bill for services I never received," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The charges are under my name, but I was never a patient at your facility on the state." There was a pause as she pulled up my account. "I'm showing here that you were seen in our emergency department on September 15th for abdominal pain. You were accompanied by, your mother, Patricia Clark, who provided your insurance information and signed consent forms as your emergency contact." The room spun around me. September 15th. I remembered that date clearly because it was the day after another severe attack that had left me bedridden.
I had called my mother in tears, begging her to take me to the emergency room, but she had insisted I was overreacting and needed to wait for my primary care appointment the following week. Can you tell me what time this visit occurred? The admission time shows 2:30 p.m., discharged at 6:45. September 15th at 2:30 p.m. I had been teaching my advanced placement biology class, leading a laboratory experiment on enzyme activity. I had attendance records, lesson plans, and 30 students who could verify my whereabouts. I definitely wasn't in any emergency room. I need to speak with your fraud department, I said, my voice gaining strength. Someone used my identity to receive medical services.
I sat in that security office, watching footage of my mother calmly providing my social security number and insurance information, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just neglect or misguided concern. This was calculated, deliberate theft of my medical identity for another person's benefit. The security supervisor, a middle-aged man named Frank Torres, looked as disturbed as I felt. "I've seen insurance fraud before, but this is particularly cruel," he said, shaking his head. "Using a family member's identity while preventing them from getting care? That's a special kind of evil." Armed with this evidence, I drove directly to Dr. Martinez's office, demanding an emergency appointment. When her nurse tried to schedule me for the following week, I explained that I had evidence of medical identity theft and needed immediate consultation. Dr. Martinez reviewed the stolen test results with growing concern. "Madison, these inflammatory markers are significantly elevated," she said, her voice grave. "The liver enzyme levels are particularly troubling. This suggests something systemic that requires immediate specialist evaluation." "My family prevented me from seeing Dr. Patterson," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They canceled my appointment and changed my insurance to make specialist care too expensive." Dr. Martinez's expression hardened. "These results indicate a serious medical condition that could worsen rapidly without treatment. The fact that someone prevented you from receiving care while obtaining it for themselves using your identity, that's not just fraud, Madison. That's a medical negligence that could have life-threatening consequences." She immediately called Dr. Patterson's office, explaining the urgent nature of my case and the fraudulent circumstances that had delayed my care. Within an hour, I had an appointment scheduled for the following morning, not in 3 months, but the next day. That evening, I called Emma directly. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but I needed to understand her role in this deception. When she answered, her voice was weak and strained. "Madison? Oh, God, I was hoping you wouldn't find out." "Find out what, Emma? That you stole my medical identity? That my mother helped you commit fraud while preventing me from getting care for the same symptoms?" There was a long silence before Emma began to cry. I was desperate," she whispered. "I've been sick for months, just like you, but I lost my job and my insurance and I couldn't afford to see a doctor. When I called Aunt Patricia for advice, she said you were having similar problems, but that your family thought you were being dramatic about it. So she suggested you impersonate me? She said it would be temporary, just to get the initial testing done. She said you were probably fine, that young women always think their problems are worse than they are. She made it sound like I needed the care more than you did because I didn't have other options." The manipulation was breathtaking. My mother had convinced Emma that I was a hypochondriac whose access to medical care was expendable while positioning her as the truly deserving patient who needed immediate help. "Emma, the test results show you have a serious condition. Did you follow up with the gastroenterologist?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. I've been receiving treatment for 3 months now. The doctor said if we hadn't caught it when we did, I could have had serious complications." Crohn's disease, a serious autoimmune condition that explained both Emma's symptoms and quite possibly my own. The disease that my family had prevented me from being tested for while ensuring Emma received prompt diagnosis and treatment. "Madison, I'm so sorry," Emma continued. "I know what we did was wrong, but I was desperate and scared, and Aunt Patricia made it seem like the right thing to do. She said your parents could afford to get you proper care later, but I needed help immediately."
The cruelty of my mother's manipulation was staggering. She had orchestrated an elaborate fraud, lied to multiple family members, and risked my health for months, all while maintaining the facade of a concerned parent who was just being practical about medical expenses. The next morning, I drove to Dr. Patterson's office with copies of Emma's stolen test results and my own documentation of symptoms. As I sat in the waiting room, I felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. I was finally going to get answers, but those answers might be worse than I had imagined. Dr. Patterson was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who listened intently as I explained the fraudulent circumstances that had delayed my care. When he showed me Emma's test results and described my identical symptoms, his expression grew increasingly serious.
Based on what you're telling me and these laboratory findings from your cousin, we need to run immediate testing to determine if you have the same condition, he said. Crohn's disease has a genetic component, and the delay in diagnosis could have allowed significant disease progression. Within 2 hours, I had undergone more comprehensive testing than I'd received in the entire previous year. Blood work, imaging studies, endoscopic procedures, everything my family had deemed unnecessary and expensive. As I waited for results, I realized that my investigation had uncovered something much larger than medical identity theft. I had discovered a pattern of manipulation and control that extended far beyond healthcare decisions. My family had demonstrated they were willing to lie, steal, and endanger my health to maintain their version of reality. But I had also discovered something else. I was much stronger than they had ever given me credit for. I had uncovered their fraud, advocated for myself, and finally obtained the medical care I needed, despite every obstacle they had put in my way. The results would come back the following week, but regardless of what they showed, I now understood that my family's betrayal went far deeper than I had ever imagined. And I was just getting started uncovering the truth. The call came on a Friday afternoon, while I was organizing my classroom for the weekend. Dr. Patterson's voice was measured but serious when he asked if I could come in Monday morning to discuss my test results in person. "Is it bad news?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "It's news that requires a comprehensive discussion about treatment options," he replied diplomatically. "I'd prefer to go over everything with you face to face." That weekend stretched endlessly. I found myself researching Crohn's disease obsessively, trying to prepare for what Monday might bring. The information was sobering but not hopeless. With proper treatment, many people with Crohn's lived normal, productive lives. The key was early diagnosis and aggressive management to prevent complications. Early diagnosis. The phrase mocked me every time I read it. If I had the same condition as Emma, my diagnosis was anything but early. Months of delay meant months of inflammation, potential scarring, and progression that could have been prevented. Monday morning, I sat across from Dr. Patterson as he spread my test results across his desk, like evidence in a trial. His expression was grave as he began explaining the findings. "Madison, your endoscopy reveals extensive inflammation throughout your small intestine and colon, consistent with moderate to severe Crohn's disease. Your inflammatory markers are significantly elevated, and we've identified several areas of concern that suggest the disease has been active for quite some time." I stared at the images of my own insides, seeing concrete proof of what I'd been feeling for months. The pain, the fatigue, the weight loss, all of it was real, documented, undeniable. "How long has this been progressing?" I asked. Dr. Patterson consulted his notes. "Based on the extent of inflammation and scarring we're seeing, I'd estimate this has been active for at least 8 to 12 months, possibly longer, but definitely advancing during the time frame you've been experiencing symptoms." 8 to 12 months. Almost the entire time I'd been begging my family for help, they'd been blocking treatment for a serious autoimmune disease that was progressively damaging my digestive system. "There's something else," Dr. Patterson continued, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. "We found evidence of a stricture, a narrowing in your small intestine caused by chronic inflammation and scarring. This is what's been causing your most severe pain episodes.
Without treatment, this could lead to complete blockage, which would require emergency surgery. The word surgery hit me like a physical blow. While my family had been dismissing my symptoms as drama and attention-seeking, I'd been developing complications that could have killed me. Could this have been prevented if I'd been treated sooner? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dr. Patterson's expression softened with what looked like anger on my behalf. Absolutely. Early intervention with anti-inflammatory medications could have prevented most of this damage. The stricture formation, in particular, might have been avoided entirely with prompt treatment. He outlined an aggressive treatment plan: immunosuppressive medications to control the inflammation, dietary modifications, and close monitoring to prevent further progression. The medications alone would cost over $1,000 a month, even with insurance coverage. "I need to be honest with you," Dr. Patterson said, as he finished explaining the treatment protocol. "This is a serious condition that requires lifelong management. The fact that you were prevented from receiving care, while someone else was treated for the identical condition using your medical identity, that's not just insurance fraud, Madison. Given the medical consequences, it could constitute criminal negligence."
As I drove home from that appointment, prescription bottles rattling in my purse, I felt a cold fury settling over me. My family hadn't just stolen my medical identity or blocked my access to care. They had enabled a disease to progress to the point where I now faced potential surgery and lifelong complications that could have been prevented. But I also felt something else: clarity. For the first time in months, I had concrete evidence that I wasn't crazy, wasn't dramatic, wasn't seeking attention. I had a legitimate medical condition that required serious treatment, and my family's actions had made it worse. That evening, I called my old college roommate, Stephanie Martinez, who had become a successful paralegal in Albany. We'd stayed in touch over the years, and she'd always been the type of person who got things done. "Steph, I need legal advice," I said without preamble. "My family committed medical identity theft, and their actions delayed treatment for a serious condition. I need to know what my options are." After I explained the situation, Stephanie was quiet for a long moment. "Madison, this is bigger than just identity theft. You're talking about insurance fraud, medical fraud, and potentially criminal negligence that resulted in bodily harm. You need a real lawyer, not just paralegal advice." She referred me to Marcus Fleming, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crimes and had experience with medical fraud cases. When I called his office, his assistant scheduled an emergency consultation for Wednesday afternoon. Marcus Fleming was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who listened to my story with the focused attention of someone accustomed to complex criminal cases. As I laid out the timeline of events, the medical identity theft, and the consequences of delayed treatment, he took detailed notes and asked pointed questions. "Do you have documentation of your mother canceling your original specialist appointment?" he asked. I showed him the voicemail transcript and appointment cancellation records I'd obtained from Dr. Patterson's office. "And you have proof that she used your insurance information for your cousin's care?" I provided copies of the hospital fraud investigation, security footage stills, and the billing records showing my information being used for Emma's treatment. Most importantly, do you have medical evidence that the delay in treatment caused additional harm? I handed him Dr. Patterson's detailed report, highlighting the sections about preventable complications and disease progression that could have been avoided with early intervention. Marcus studied the documents for several minutes before looking up at me. "Madison, you have an exceptionally strong case for both civil and criminal charges. Your mother orchestrated a complex fraud scheme that directly resulted in medical harm. The fact that she had knowledge of your cousin's diagnosis while continuing to block your access to care elevates this to a level of malice that most juries would find unconscionable." "What are my options?" I asked. "Multiple paths. Criminal charges for insurance fraud, medical identity theft, and potentially aggravated assault given the bodily harm that resulted.
civil suits for medical malpractice against the urgent care facility that failed to properly evaluate you, and personal injury claims against your family members for the damages caused by their fraudulent actions. He outlined a strategy that would involve coordinating with the district attorney's office to pursue criminal charges while simultaneously filing civil suits to recover damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and the ongoing costs of lifelong treatment. There's something else to consider, Marcus added. Your mother works in community of positions of trust, school board, charity organizations. Your father's insurance business is built on integrity and trustworthiness. Criminal fraud convictions would destroy their reputations and likely their livelihoods. The thought of my parents facing serious consequences for their actions was both terrifying and satisfying. They had gambled with my health and lost. Now they would face the repercussions. But before making any legal moves, I needed to confront them directly. I needed to see their faces when presented with evidence of what they had done. I needed to give them a chance to explain themselves, if any explanation was possible. I scheduled a family meeting for Sunday dinner, the same weekly tradition where they'd spent months dismissing my health concerns. But this time, I would be setting the agenda. I spent the week preparing meticulously. I organized every piece of evidence into a comprehensive presentation: medical records, fraud investigation reports, security footage stills, and Dr. Patterson's diagnosis and treatment recommendations. I practiced what I would say, how I would present the information, and how I would maintain my composure when they inevitably tried to deflect or minimize their actions. Saturday night, I called Emma one more time. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "How are you feeling?" I asked, genuinely concerned about her health despite everything that had happened. "Better," she said quietly. "The treatment is working. Dr. Patterson says my inflammation levels are almost normal now. Madison, I know I can never make up for what we did to you, but I want you to know I've been eaten alive by guilt every day since you found out. Emma, you were desperate and sick. My mother manipulated you into thinking what you did was justified. You're not the villain in the story." "But I am responsible," she insisted. "I could have found another way, could have questioned whether using your identity was really okay. I was just so scared, and Aunt Patricia made it seem like the only option." "What did she tell you about my condition after you were diagnosed?" She was quiet for a moment. "She said you probably didn't have the same thing, that young women often have similar symptoms that turn out to be stress or anxiety. She said knowing about my diagnosis would just make you more convinced you had something serious when you probably didn't. She thought it was better to let you work through it naturally rather than feeding into what she called your tendency to catastrophize health issues." Even after Emma's diagnosis confirmed that our symptoms were caused by a serious medical condition, my mother had continued the deception. She had concrete proof that I likely had the same disease, and she'd chosen to withhold that information while I continued to deteriorate. "Emma, I'm going to confront them tomorrow. I'm going to present all the evidence and give them a chance to explain themselves. After that, I'm probably going to pursue legal action."
"I understand," she said. "And Madison, whatever happens, I'll testify about what really happened. It's the least I can do." Sunday morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. Today would be the day I reclaimed my narrative, the day I stopped being the victim of their manipulation and became the architect of their accountability. I dressed carefully, professional but not intimidating, confident but not aggressive. I wanted to look like the competent adult I was, not the dramatic child they'd painted me as. As I drove to my parents' house, past the familiar landmarks of my childhood, I thought about all the Sunday dinners I'd attended while suffering in silence, all the times I'd sat at that table being subtly undermined and dismissed, all the occasions when I'd left feeling smaller and less sure of myself. Today would be different. Today, I was bringing proof. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Pristine landscaping, perfect paint, the image of successful suburban respectability.
But I now understood that image was built on lies, manipulation, and a willingness to sacrifice their own daughter's health to maintain their version of reality. I parked in the driveway, gathered my evidence folder, and walked to the front door. As I rang the doorbell, I realized this might be the last normal family interaction I would ever have. But normal had never really existed in this family anyway. Today, we were finally going to deal with the truth. Sunday dinner at the Clark house had always followed the same ritual. Patricia would spend hours preparing an elaborate meal. The dining room would be set with the good china, and conversation would flow around safe topics, local news, community events, Daniel's children's achievements. It was theater, a performance of family harmony that masked deeper dysfunctions. But today, I was directing the show. I arrived exactly at 5 o'clock, my evidence folder tucked discreetly in my purse. The familiar smell of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding greeted me at the door, but my stomach churned with anticipation rather than hunger. "Madison, sweetheart," my mother called from the kitchen, her voice carrying its usual forced cheer. "You look thin. Are you eating enough?" The irony of her concern about my weight loss caused by the very condition she'd prevented me from treating, was almost laughable. I managed a neutral smile and took my usual seat at the dining room table. Daniel and Sarah arrived with their kids, 6-year-old Tyler and 4-year-old Emma. The children's laughter filled the house as they ran around the living room, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break over their grandparents' heads. "How's school going?" Daniel asked as he helped Tyler into his booster seat. "Still enjoying the teaching life?" "It's been challenging," I replied carefully. "I've had some health issues that have made things difficult." My father looked up from carving the roast, his expression already shifting to that familiar dismissive mode. "Still having those stomach problems? I thought the urgent care doctor took care of that months ago." "We need to talk about that," I said, my voice steady. "All of us, after dinner." Something in my tone must have registered because Patricia paused in her bustling around the kitchen, studying my face with sharp eyes. "Talk about what, dear?" "After dinner," I repeated, "when we can speak privately." The meal proceeded with forced normalcy, but tension crackled beneath the surface. My parents kept exchanging glances, and Daniel seemed to sense something was off. Sarah made small talk about her job at the bank, but even she appeared uncomfortable with the undercurrent of unease. I barely touched my food, my appetite long since destroyed by months of pain and the knowledge of what I was about to reveal. Every bite felt like swallowing glass, knowing that my family had sat through dozens of these dinners while actively concealing information that could have prevented my suffering. After dessert, Sarah took the children to the living room to watch a movie, while the adults remained at the dining room table. This was the moment I'd been preparing for all week. I pulled out my evidence folder and placed it on the table. "I know what you did," I said simply. The color drained from my mother's face so quickly I thought she might faint. My father's fork clattered against his dessert plate, and Daniel leaned forward with confusion. "What's that supposed to mean?" Robert asked, but his voice lacked conviction. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, the hospital bill that started my investigation. "This is a bill for emergency room services I never received. Services provided to someone using my name and insurance information." Patricia's hands began to tremble. She reached for her water glass but knocked it over instead, sending ice water cascading across the white tablecloth. "I don't understand," Daniel said, looking between me and our parents. "What are you talking about?" I spread out the security footage stills showing my mother and Emma in the hospital waiting room. "This is Mom using my medical identity to get treatment for Emma. Emma, who has the same symptoms I've been begging you to take seriously for months. Madison," my mother started, but I cut her off. "Emma was diagnosed with Crohn's disease," I continued, pulling out Dr. Patterson's report. "A serious autoimmune condition that requires immediate treatment. The same condition I was just diagnosed with this week after months of delay that caused preventable complications." I laid out the endoscopy images, showing the inflammation and scarring in my digestive tract. "These are pictures of my insides. This damage could have been prevented if I'd received treatment when I first asked for help. Instead, you canceled my appointments, changed my insurance, and stole my medical identity to get care for someone else.
Daniel stared at the documents, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and slowly dawning horror. "Mom, is this true?" Patricia sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The carefully composed mask she'd worn for decades was cracking, revealing something desperate and cornered underneath. "You don't understand," she finally whispered. "Emma was desperate. She had no insurance, no money. You had resources, options. I was trying to help everyone." "By committing fraud?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "By gambling with my health while ensuring Emma got the care she needed?" "You were fine," Patricia snapped, her composure finally shattering completely. "You were still working, still functioning. Emma was really sick, really suffering. I made a judgment call about who needed help more urgently." The admission hung in the air like poison gas. She had literally decided that my suffering was less valid than Emma's identical symptoms, that my need for medical care was expendable while Emma's was critical. "Look at these test results," I said, sliding the inflammatory marker reports across the table. "I was never fine. I had a serious medical condition that was getting worse every day you delayed my treatment." Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "We thought you were being dramatic. You've always been sensitive about medical issues." "Sensitive?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was developing intestinal strictures that could have required emergency surgery. I was losing weight, missing work, crying myself to sleep from pain, and you thought I was being sensitive? I pulled out the most damning piece of evidence, the handwritten note in my mother's writing about Emma's insurance coverage expiring. You planned this. You knew exactly what you were doing when you stole my identity for Emma's benefit. Daniel had been studying the documents with the analytical mind that made him successful in business. When he looked up, his expression was stricken. "Mom, this isn't just insurance fraud. This is criminal. Madison could have died from complications while you were preventing her from getting treatment." "Don't be so dramatic," Patricia said, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. "It wasn't that serious." I pulled out the final document, Dr. Patterson's medical opinion letter that Marcus Fleming had requested, explicitly stating that the delay in treatment had caused preventable harm and could have resulted in life-threatening complications. The gastroenterologist disagrees. According to his medical opinion, your actions directly caused permanent damage to my digestive system and put me at risk for complications that could have been fatal. The silence that followed was deafening. Even from the living room, I could hear the children's movie playing, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the destruction happening at the dining table. "What do you want?" my father asked finally, his voice hollow. It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when the power dynamic in this family would shift permanently. "I want you to understand what you did. I want you to acknowledge that you prioritized Emma's health over mine, that you committed multiple felonies, and that your actions caused me permanent harm." "And then," Patricia asked, her voice barely audible, I gathered the documents back into my folder. "Then I'm going to decide whether to pursue criminal charges against you." The words hit them like physical blows. My mother actually gasped, and my father's face went gray. "Criminal charges?" Daniel asked. "Madison, surely we can work this out as a family." This stopped being a family matter when they committed insurance fraud and medical identity theft, when their actions resulted in preventable medical complications that I'll deal with for the rest of my life. I stood up from the table, looking down at the three people who had raised me, who had claimed to love me, who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. I've consulted with a criminal defense attorney. He believes I have strong cases for both criminal prosecution and civil suits. Insurance fraud, medical identity theft, criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm. My mother was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body.
Please, Madison, we never meant for you to get hurt. We were trying to help Emma. By ensuring I couldn't get help myself, you had a choice between helping your niece legally or stealing from your daughter. You chose theft. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. You have 1 week to think about whether you want to make this right voluntarily or whether you want to face criminal prosecution. My attorney will be in touch either way. As I left that house, I could hear my mother's wailing and my father's attempts to calm her. Daniel followed me to my car, his face stricken. Madison, please. I know what they did was wrong, but they're our parents. Surely there's some way to handle this that doesn't destroy the family. I looked at my brother, this man who had dismissed my pain as psychological, who had suggested I was catastrophizing my symptoms, who had enabled our parents' harmful behavior through his silence and support.
Daniel, they didn't just betray me, I said. They committed serious crimes that caused me permanent physical harm. The family was destroyed the moment they decided Emma's health was more important than mine. I got in my car and drove away, leaving behind the house where I'd grown up, the dinner table where I'd been systematically undermined for months, and the people who had proven that their love came with conditions I could never meet. As I drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was the one making decisions about my future. I was the one with evidence, with legal options, with the ability to hold them accountable for their actions. They had gambled with my health and lost. Now it was time for them to pay the consequences. The week I'd given them wasn't really about giving them time to make things right. Nothing could undo the damage they'd caused or erase the betrayal I'd experienced. The week was about giving myself time to decide exactly how much justice I wanted to pursue. But one thing was certain: I would never again be the victim of their manipulation. I would never again doubt my own perceptions because they told me I was being dramatic. I would never again prioritize their comfort over my own well-being. The girl who had walked into that house, still hoping for an explanation, still clinging to the possibility that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, was gone. In her place was a woman who understood exactly what her family was capable of and exactly what she was going to do about it. The real reckoning was just beginning. The phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. on Monday morning. I let it go to voicemail, already knowing it would be my family beginning their damage control campaign. By the time I left for school, I had 14 missed calls and 7 voicemails, ranging from my mother's tearful pleas to my father's attempts at legal intimidation. "Madison, you're being unreasonable," Robert's voice carried through my phone speaker as I listened while getting dressed. "We can discuss this like adults without involving lawyers and destroying people's lives over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Even after seeing irrefutable evidence of their fraud, he was still trying to minimize what they'd done. The last voicemail was from Daniel, his voice strained and desperate. "Madison, Mom's had a panic attack. She's talking about what this will do to her reputation, her position on the school board. Dad's worried about his business license. Please call me back. We need to find a solution that works for everyone." Their panic was immediate and visceral, but it was focused entirely on themselves. Not one message expressed genuine remorse for the harm they'd caused me or concern for my ongoing health issues. They were worried about their reputations, their careers, their social standing, the same priorities that had led them to commit fraud in the first place. At school, I found it difficult to concentrate on teaching. My first period biology class was discussing genetic disorders, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was explaining how traits pass from generation to generation while dealing with a genetic condition my own family had prevented me from treating. During my lunch break, I called Marcus Fleming to update him on the confrontation. "How did they respond to the evidence?" he asked. "Complete admission of guilt, but they're positioning it as helping Emma rather than harming me. They're already calling it a misunderstanding and trying to pressure me into handling it as
a family. Marcus chuckled grimly. Classic white-collar criminal response. They're hoping family loyalty will override legal accountability. Are you having second thoughts about pursuing charges? No, I said without hesitation. If anything, their reaction has convinced me they haven't learned anything. They're still more concerned about their reputations than the fact that they nearly killed me through medical negligence. Good. I've been working with the district attorney's office, and they're very interested in this case. Medical identity theft with bodily harm is exactly the kind of fraud they want to prosecute aggressively. It sends a message that stealing someone's medical care has serious consequences. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at school. Janet Morrison knocked on my classroom door during my planning period, her expression concerned. "Madison, honey, I just heard the strangest thing," she said, closing the door behind her. "My neighbor works at the bank and she said your father was in there this morning trying to liquidate some investment accounts. Is everything okay?" The fact that my father was already moving money around suggested he understood the gravity of his legal situation. He was preparing for the financial consequences of criminal prosecution and civil suits. "Things are complicated right now," I said carefully, "but I'm handling it." Janet studied my face with the perceptive eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading teenagers' emotions. "This has something to do with your health problems, doesn't it? You look different, stronger, but also angry." "I found out what was really wrong with me," I said, "and I found out why it took so long to get answers." "Your family?" she asked quietly. I nodded, surprised by her intuition. "I wondered," Janet said. "The way they talked about your symptoms never sat right with me. Too dismissive, too coordinated, like they'd rehearsed their responses." Her observation was chilling because it was accurate. My family had presented a united front in dismissing my health concerns, speaking with one voice about my supposed tendency to drama and exaggeration. That evening, I drove to Emma's apartment in Rochester. She'd been staying with a friend since her diagnosis, unable to afford her own place while undergoing expensive treatment. When she answered the door, she looked healthier than I'd seen her in years. The Crohn's treatment was clearly working. "Madison, I've been expecting you," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I know you probably hate me."
I don't hate you, Emma, but I need to understand exactly what happened, and I need to know if you'll testify truthfully about Mom's role in this. We sat in her friend's modest living room while Emma explained the full scope of my mother's manipulation. The story was even worse than I'd imagined. "It started 6 months before the hospital visit," Emma said. "I'd been calling Aunt Patricia for advice about my symptoms because I couldn't afford to see a doctor. She kept asking detailed questions about what I was experiencing, and I thought she was just being supportive. But she was comparing your symptoms to mine," I realized. "Exactly. She said you were having similar problems, but that your family thought you were being dramatic about it. She made it sound like you were known for exaggerating health issues and that you had access to good health care but were choosing to be difficult about it. The manipulation had been carefully orchestrated over months, not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Patricia had been gathering information about Emma's symptoms while simultaneously undermining my credibility within the family." "She suggested the identity swap?" I asked. "She presented it as a temporary solution. She said your insurance was excellent and wouldn't be affected by one emergency room visit, but that it would save my life because I couldn't afford the testing I needed. She made it sound almost noble, like I was helping prove that your symptoms weren't serious while getting the care I desperately needed." "And after you were diagnosed?" Emma's face crumpled. "That's when it got really twisted. When the test results came back showing Crohn's disease, I wanted to call you immediately. I knew you needed to be tested for the same thing. But Aunt Patricia convinced me that telling you would be cruel." "How could telling me be cruel?" "She said you were already anxious about your health and that knowing about my diagnosis would send you into a panic spiral about having the same condition. She said it was better to let you work through your symptoms naturally, and that if you really had Crohn's, it would become obvious on its own without the psychological pressure of knowing about my diagnosis. The cruelty was breathtaking. My mother had convinced Emma that withholding critical medical information was an act of kindness, that allowing me to suffer without answers was somehow protecting my mental health. She also said, Emma continued, her voice barely audible, that your parents were planning to get you proper testing eventually, but they wanted to do it through their own doctors and their own timeline. She made it sound like they had everything under control and I shouldn't interfere. Every piece of Emma's story revealed new layers of Patricia's deception. She hadn't just committed fraud, she'd orchestrated an elaborate psychological campaign to justify it, manipulating both Emma and me while maintaining her position as the caring family matriarch, making difficult decisions for everyone's benefit. Emma, I need you to document all of this. Write down every conversation, every justification she gave you, every detail you can remember. My attorney needs a complete picture of how premeditated this was. I'll do whatever you need, Emma said. I know I can never make up for what happened, but I want to help you get justice. Wednesday morning, the deadline I'd given my family, arrived without any contact from them. No apology, no attempt to make restitution, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Their silence was the final confirmation I needed. I called Marcus Fleming. File everything, I said. Criminal charges, civil suits, the works. Are you sure? He asked. Once we file criminal charges, there's no going back. Your family will face serious legal consequences. I replied, they had a week to show some remorse or take responsibility. Instead, they're hiding money and trying to protect their reputations. They've made their choice. Within hours, the legal machinery was in motion. Marcus coordinated with the district attorney's office to file criminal charges for insurance fraud, medical identity theft, and criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm. Simultaneously, he filed civil suits for medical malpractice, personal injury, and intentional infliction of emotional stress. The first indication that the legal proceedings had begun came Thursday afternoon when my father's insurance agency was visited by investigators from the State Insurance Commission. Someone had reported potential fraud by a licensed insurance agent, triggering an investigation that could result in the suspension or revocation of his business license. By Friday, the story had leaked to the local newspaper. The Millbrook Gazette ran a front-page article titled, "Local Insurance Agent Under Investigation for Medical Fraud." The article didn't name me as the victim, but in a town the size of Millbrook, everyone would figure out the connections quickly. Patricia's position on the school board became untenable almost immediately. The scandal of medical fraud allegations was incompatible with her role overseeing the district's policies and budget. She submitted her resignation before the next board meeting, citing personal family matters requiring her full attention. The social consequences were swift and brutal. The Clarks had built their identities around community respect and moral authority. They were the family other people looked up to, the ones who organized charity drives and sat on important committees. The revelation that they'd committed serious fraud to deny medical care to their own daughter while stealing it for someone else shattered that carefully constructed image. I watched their world crumble from a distance, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. These were people who had raised me, who had attended my school plays and graduation ceremonies, who had been loving parents in many ways. But they were also people who had been willing to gamble with my life to maintain their version of reality. The investigation revealed additional details that made their actions even more damning. Financial records showed that my parents had the resources to pay for Emma's medical care legally, but had chosen fraud instead because it was easier and cheaper. They hadn't been faced with an impossible choice between helping their daughter or their niece. They'd simply decided that stealing from me was more convenient than paying for Emma's care for themselves.
As the legal proceedings moved forward, I focused on rebuilding my health and my life. The Crohn's treatment was working. My inflammation levels were dropping, and for the first time in over a year, I was beginning to feel like myself again. The physical healing paralleled the emotional recovery. Both required time, proper treatment, and the removal of toxic influences. My teaching colleagues rallied around me with overwhelming support. The truth about my family's actions had spread through the school quickly, and everyone from the principal to the cafeteria staff expressed outrage on my behalf. Janet Morrison organized a card campaign where every staff member wrote messages of support, creating a thick stack of encouragement that meant more to me than any legal victory. But the most meaningful support came from my students. Teenagers have an acute sense of justice, and when they learned, through the inevitable gossip network, that their teacher had been denied medical care by her own family, their indignation was fierce and protective. "Miss Clark, that's messed up," one of my sophomores said after class. "Family is supposed to take care of each other, not steal from each other." Out of the mouths of babes. A 15-year-old understood something my parents had failed to grasp: that love means protecting the people you care about, not exploiting them for others' benefit. As I stood in my classroom that Friday afternoon, organizing materials for next week's lessons on genetic inheritance, I reflected on the irony of my situation. I was teaching students about how traits pass from generation to generation while dealing with the consequences of inheriting both a genetic disease and a family incapable of providing the support I needed to manage it. But I had also inherited something else: the strength to fight for myself when no one else would, the determination to seek truth when surrounded by lies, the courage to hold people accountable for their actions, even when those people were family. The legal proceedings would continue for months, but the essential victory was already mine. I had reclaimed my narrative, exposed the truth, and ensured that my family would face consequences for their actions. Most importantly, I had saved my own life by refusing to accept their version of reality. They had bet that I would stay quiet, that family loyalty would override my need for justice, that I would prioritize their comfort over my own well-being. They had lost that bet spectacularly, and I was just getting started collecting on their debt. 18 months later, I watched my father sign the final settlement documents in the courthouse hallway. Robert Clark looked broken, his business license revoked, his agency dissolved, his reputation destroyed. The criminal proceedings had concluded with plea bargains that shocked our community. Patricia received probation and community service for insurance fraud and medical identity theft. Robert faced suspended jail time, massive fines, and permanent disbarment from the insurance industry. The civil settlements covered all my medical expenses and future treatment costs. Most satisfying was discovering my parents had hidden significant assets offshore while claiming they couldn't afford Emma's legitimate medical care. Asset forfeiture meant they lost almost everything. "This concludes all matters," Marcus Fleming said, approaching with his briefcase. "The final check should be deposited Tuesday." Justice had been served, but feeling winning felt different than I had imagined. As we left, I saw my mother sitting alone outside. Patricia Clark, who once commanded every room, now looked fragile and diminished. When our eyes met, I saw genuine remorse, not calculated regret, but actual recognition of harm caused. "Madison, could I speak with you?" she asked quietly. We stood facing each other in the sunlight, strangers connected only by legal documents and shared DNA. "I was wrong," Patricia began shakily. "Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. I convinced myself I was helping everyone, but I was really protecting myself from difficult financial decisions." It was the apology I'd waited 2 years to hear, but it felt hollow now. "You nearly killed me, Mom," I said simply. "While I developed life-threatening complications, you ensured Emma got treatment using my stolen identity. Even after knowing our identical conditions, you chose to let me suffer." "I know," she whispered. "I lost my daughter to save money and protect my pride.
I destroyed our family because I couldn't admit my terrible decisions. Understanding doesn't undo the damage. I'll need lifelong medical monitoring because of the complications you caused. This is goodbye, Mom. I walked away toward the future I was building from their betrayal's ashes. My health had stabilized dramatically with proper treatment. The inflammation was controlled, the stricture healed without surgery, and I'd regained lost weight. I'd rebuilt my life around people who supported me unconditionally. Janet Morrison had become like a second mother, and my colleague relationships had deepened into genuine friendships. I'd also found love with Dr. Michael Chen, a rheumatologist who understood chronic illness in ways my family never had. He saw strength rather than weakness, determination rather than drama. "How did it go?" he asked when I arrived home. "It's over," I said, settling into his arms. "All of it."
That afternoon, the superintendent offered me a new position, student health advocate, combining my teaching experience with healthcare advocacy skills developed during my battles. "You understand when medical issues aren't taken seriously," Dr. Williams said. "You could help other families avoid what you experienced." It was perfect, using my painful experience to prevent other suffering. My family's betrayal had been devastating but transformative. It forced me to develop unknown strength, fight unimaginable battles, and rebuild according to my values rather than their expectations. That night, Michael and I planned our future together: marriage, children, building a family based on honesty and unconditional love. "Do you wonder what would have happened if they'd let you see Dr. Patterson initially?" he asked. "Sometimes. I'd have been diagnosed quickly and avoided complications. But I might never have learned my real strength or escaped that dysfunctional dynamic forever." My family's betrayal had been the catalyst for discovering my power, understanding my worth, and demanding deserved respect. 3 years after that first canceled appointment, I stood before parents at Roosevelt High School, presenting about advocating for children's health. "Love means taking health seriously and getting proper medical care," I told the audience. "It doesn't mean minimizing symptoms or delaying treatment for convenience." After the presentation, a tearful mother approached. "My daughter's been complaining of stomach pain for months, and my husband says she's faking. After your story, I realize we need proper evaluation." These moments gave meaning to everything I'd endured. My family's betrayal had become a tool for helping others avoid similar tragedies. My phone buzzed. "Dinner's ready when you get home. Proud of you always, Michael." Home had new meaning now, not the house where I'd grown up with hidden dysfunction, but the place I'd built with people who saw my strength, supported my health, and celebrated my victories. I'd lost a family, but gained something infinitely more valuable: knowledge that I could survive anything, strength to fight for what I deserved, and wisdom to build relationships based on genuine love rather than convenient control. My family had canceled my doctor's appointment, thinking they could cancel my agency. Instead, they'd given me the greatest gift: realizing I was strong enough to save my own life, fight my own battles, and build my own definition of family. As I drove through Millbrook's familiar streets, past my childhood house, toward the future I'd created from nothing, I smiled. They'd tried to write me out of my own story. Instead, I'd become the author of my own happy ending.